Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 20th chapter in the book of Revelation. There are three main things we learn herein: the 1,000-year rule which awaits us, the Satan's ultimate defeat and doom, and the final judgment. And the 1,000-year rule which awaits us is known as the millennial dispensation. Millennial is Latin for 1,000 years, and there will be 7 dispensations. 7 is the number of divine perfection. The first dispensation was the dispensation of innocence. Adam and Eve were created innocent, untainted by sin. Then they fell through the abuse of the agency, and then they grew a conscience. So that's the second dispensation, the dispensation of conscience. The third dispensation is the dispensation of government. Not long after Elohim all but eradicated the human race from the earth, but he left Noah alive to perpetuate the human race. Governments became necessary because much of the ineradicably evil nature which had precipitated the flood remained in them, so it became necessary for laws and force to restrain some of man's wilder impulses. Then the fourth dispensation is the dispensation of promise. This is giving to Abram, as he was then known, which is the promise to be a blessing and to be a global blessing, and he will be blessed, and also that from his loins will spring the Messiah. So all 4 of these dispensations occur in the book of Genesis. Then at Mount Sinai, the 5th dispensation, the dispensation of law, is initiated from Yahweh to Moses, and this was the governing period which defined Israel's how they were to worship, how were they to interact, how they were to sacrifice, how they were to conduct the ceremonial elements of their religious practice. So a dispensation roughly translates as a way in which divinity relates to humanity in the earth. And then in the New Testament, beginning in the book of Acts, is the dispensation of church, alternately known as the dispensation of grace. And so we are the new Israel. We are the chosen people. We are not national in charter. And the 7th and final dispensation which awaits us is the millennial dispensation, of which we'll soon read. But we have no idea how long this present dispensation will last, and we are in fact encouraged against speculating as to the time. But we do know that the dispensation which awaits us will be the consummation of life as we know it on earth, and that will last 1,000 years. And it's been over 2,000 years thus far. And even though we're discouraged from speculating, I personally think we have 150 years tops before the second coming. But there's also 3 schools of thought pertaining to the millennial. I just want to briefly introduce them. The first of which is amillennialism. Now, the prefix a means not, so it sort of denies or go against the whole notion of a millennial. So they think it's a present reign. It's not going to be a literal 1,000 years. Yahshua's going to return. Then there's going to be a general resurrection, not the resurrection. There's 2 resurrections spoken of in the book of Revelation. We'll get to that when we get to that. They think it's all just going to be a general one. Then the final judgment, and then the eternal reign, which initiates after the final judgment is executed. And our personal standard for scriptural interpretation is that if the literal sense makes common sense, seek no other sense. So a lot of people struggle, for example, with Genesis 1, that it was 6 literal days that it creates. So they kind of elasticate it. They think a day could mean 1,000 years, because that's what Psalm 90 verse 4 and 2 Peter 3:4 right, but it is the Hebrew term is a literal 24-hour period. Then there's the premillennialism, which his return is going to result in the first resurrection. Then there's a final resurrection, and the new heaven and new earth is going to merge. The temporal kingdom, which the control of the earth is going to return to its rightful owner, the one who created it. Satan is no longer the Elohim of this world. He is cast into the bottomless pit, we read, and then the temporal kingdom is going to merge with the eternal kingdom. And then post-millennialism, now pre and post, these prefixes indicate before or after. So the postmillennial is going to close with the second coming and the resurrection of the dead, then the final judgment in the eternal state. So the 1,000-year rule is going to take place before the second coming, and we personally endorse the premillennial one for reasons we may make sense as we comment on the verses itself. Opening verse. And I saw an angel come down from the heavens, having the key to the pit of the deep, and the great chain in his hand. John is the eye, he is the beholder of these visions. Revelation is a series of visions pertaining to the end times and the consummation of human history. And this angel descends from heaven. He comes down. Angels are winged creatures, so we can imagine he's flying down, and he has the key to the bottomless pit. This is distinct from hell because the pit is sort of a probationary period. It's a prison, but it's not quite the same thing as hell, and the chain is what's going to bind the adversary here. And he seized the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. So the dragon, we read in Revelation 12:9 that the dragon, that is Satan, is cast from the heaven. Now we read he's going to be cast from the earth. While he reigns here, he is likened to the Elohim of the earth by the Savior himself. That is the only designation he applied it outside of his Father. But he's going to be away from his present domain, and he's going to be bound for 1,000 years, during which time the righteous rule will be established without his interference, because his mission and ministry is to tempt the inhabitants of the earth, to lead them away and astray from righteous living and equality and justice and all those other virtues. And he threw him into the pit of the deep, and shut him up, and put a seal on him, so that he should lead the nations no more astray, until the 1,000 years were ended. And after that he has to be released for a little while. So the purpose, he's not done. He's still going to do his thing and be his own person, but he's going to be disabled from doing so because he's going to be physically distanced and imprisoned in a bottomless pit below the earth, where he will not have access to the earth. The Messiah will sit on his throne, where he will rule in perfect justice and equity. And leading astray and deceiving is his nature and his ministry. He is the author of deception. But when the 1,000 years are ended, he's going to be released. That is by the divine initiative and permission for a little while. We don't know how long a little while is. We have the exact date that it's going to be for a period of 1,000 years. A little while, I've heard speculation that it's going to be 3.5 years, but that is ultimately speculation. The only thing we do know is that we don't know how long this will be, and the purpose for which he's going to be released is to lead those who had lived in perfect harmony and perfect peace and perfect shalom astray. So they still, even though they had experienced the righteous rule of the heavenly king on earth, they will still be liable to temptation and be letting astray, but it's only his presence that allows them. So if Satan is eliminated, there would be no evil on the earth, but there is evil on the earth because he is the Elohim of the earth. And I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them, and the lives of those who had been beheaded because of the witness they bore to Yahshua, and because of the word of Yahweh, who did not worship the beast, nor his image, and did not receive his mark upon their foreheads or upon their hands, and they lived and reigned with Messiah for 1,000 years. So during the tribulation, the 7-year rise and rule of the anti-Messiah, he's going to come as a peacemaker. He's going to squash a turbulent situation in the Middle East and consolidate all the nations on the earth in one world government. And this period of 3.5 years exhaust the description of the bulk of the book of Revelation. So a lot happens in those 3.5 years. Now, there's not going to be any conflict in the 1,000-year period where the earth will be ruled righteously. So there's not a whole lot to discuss, but a lot will happen in those particularly in the 3.5 years, namely that one must receive the mark of the beast in order to engage in to engage in commerce or anything, but there will be a righteous remnant of Christians who refuse to submit to the adversary's minion and prop, and they will be beheaded. And this persecution during the tribulation is going to be unlike anything the world has ever seen, witnessed, or experienced. It's going to dwarf all the preceding persecutions, but there will be a faithful remnant, and they will resist and they will be resurrected for their resistance. So they are the first resurrection. Those who are martyred in the end times will be the first first resurrection. So there are two resurrections spoken of in the book of Revelation and the Bible itself. And the rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. So the rest of the dead, that would be the dead who are awaiting and expecting the resurrection, their time will come after the 1,000 years on earth. So the earth is going to be inhabited by these martyred Christians who resisted the temptation to submit to the anti-Messiah. And so that the first resurrection, and then there's the second one. Blessed and sacred is the one having part in the first resurrection. The second death possesses no authority over these, but they shall be priests of Yahweh and of Messiah, and shall reign with him for 1,000 years. This is the fifth such blessing of Revelation. I think a blessing is attached to reading this book in chapter 1, verse 3, and also 22. And there's also four other, or rather, 5 others besides this one. So one comes after that. That's the one in verse 22. But, it is going to be a blessing to behold, to stand and witness, and to be resurrected after having your head taken off of you physically, to be resurrected in bodily form, to reign on the earth with the Messiah. So they have the privilege of reigning with him. So it's not going to be a complete dictatorship. They're going to share in the judgment, and they're going to share in the rule. And ultimately, if all men were angels, no government would be necessary, to quote our own James Madison. So there's not going to be a need for an iron fist or even police forces or military. Some of the Old Testament prophets write of the day when the weapons of war will be obsolete. This is the day which they speak of, because every single person is going to be resurrected and exalted, and not Satan's not going to be around to instill the impetus to war amongst humanity, which has largely defined human history. And when the 1,000 years have ended, Satan shall be released from his prison. So Satan is not done yet. His imprisonment is temporary. He's going to be released for a purpose of leading those who are still liable to be led astray, even though they had experienced all the peace, all the prosperity, all the shalom, all the serenity of living and reigning with the Messiah. They're still going to have that sin nature. They're still going to be liable to temptation, and some of them have to fall, and it's all part of the divine design. And he shall go out and lead the nations astray, which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for battle, whose number is as the sand of the sea. So Gog and Magog are nations to the north of Israel. The prophet Ezekiel writes of them in the 38th and 39th chapter. Now, those chapters are not the Battle of Armageddon, but here we witness that nation. They are not the only nations. There are the four corners of the earth. Every nation is going to be there. He's going to gather them, and they're going to be innumerable, like into the number of the sand on the seashore. So that's going to be a force to be reckoned with. But they're ultimately, now Satan was already manhandled in the first 2 verses by an angel, and even Michael the archangel in Jude's 9th verse, he doesn't try and face Satan on his own strength, but what does he say? He says, Yahweh rebuke thee. But this Satan will be weakened enough for a single angel to dominate him. But he's still going to, fight to the bitter end and take his... do his thing and roar and try and lead as many down with him, because he knows his hour is especially short at this moment. So after 1,000 years of being locked up and cooped up, he's going to have boundless energy to tempt and lead astray. So he's going to be all the more effective, perhaps, in tempting. His techniques will be refined in prison. And they came up over the breadth of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. And fire came down from Elohim out of the heavens, and consumed them. So even though they're all gathered, all prepared, and all surrounding the beloved city, that is sacred city, is Jerusalem, but they're going to be no match, because Elohim is going to send showers of rain from the sky, which will destroy and consume them all. And this is a prelude to the lake of fire. So they're going to meet the fire on earth, and they're going to experience it in hell, and we'll get to that when we get to that. And the devil, who led them astray, was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur, where the beast and the false prophet are, and they shall be tortured day and night, forever and ever. Now, in the end times, we are warned in the Mount Olivet discourses and the synoptic gospels that there will be many plural false messiahs and false prophets, but there is also a singular false prophet and anti-messiah who is referenced in the book of Revelation. Now, I personally, I have thought that the false prophets and the followers will be the Islamic people, but I could be wrong. There could be a false prophet who exists and serve the he serves as the mouthpiece to give legitimacy to the anti-Messiah. He's going to be his second minion, but they're already there, and Satan is going to join them, and they're going to be tortured day and night forever and ever. Now, the lake of fire does not mean that they burn for all eternity in a fire, but it means that they instantly evaporate, and then their immortal soul lingers disembodied in eternal solitude forever and ever, without beginning, without end. No one to comfort them, no one to talk to, no one to be with, just your own self. So it's not, it's less frightening than burning for all eternity, but it's still not going to be enviable. And I saw a great white throne, and him who was sitting on it, from those whose face on the earth and the heavens fled away, and no place was found for them. So white is emblematic of divinity and purity, and the one who sits on the white throne is none other than Elohim, that is at his heavenly throne, where his supremacy extends over all the earth and the heavens too, and there's going to be no place that was found for them. So that means the false prophet, the anti-Messiah, and the Satan, there's going to be no place left for them but the lake of fire. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before the throne, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is life. And the dead were judged from what was written in the books, according to their works. So there are books of life and books of remembrance referenced throughout the Old and New Testaments. Malachi references them. I think in Luke 10, the Savior says, rejoice not that you have power over the unclean spirits, but that your name is registered in the book of life. The book of life is the book of salvation that separates those who, I don't want to say merit salvation, because none of us do, but those who have salvation, those who have exercised saving faith in the doctrine of the atonement. And the other book is those who are hellbound and destined for hell, to burn instantly, eviscerate instantly in the lake of fire, then spend an essential eternity in solitude with their disembodied soul departed from their body, and they're going to be there, and they're going to have no way out and nothing to look forward to. And the sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and the grave gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to their works. So our works are how we're going to be judged. This is the juxt of the passage, I believe, of 1 Corinthians 3:8. Each of us has to answer for our works, and we will be judged accordingly to them. And the dead are now the second death is the spiritual death. So we all undergo a first death, a physical death, but those who are gifted with the resurrection will not undergo the judgment or the second death, which when we are disembodied and our immortal soul lingers without a body. And the death and the grave were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death. So this is the second death that I mentioned in anticipation of actually reading this. Distinct from the first death, the physical death. This is every human's lot in life. We are all designed to decay and perish in accordance to the laws of nature and physics, but some of us will survive spiritually and receive resurrected bodies, perfected bodies, which are designed to withstand and endure for all eternity. So our current frames and bodies, it's prone to ailment and sickness and ultimately disease, decay, and death. But we don't have to worry about that once we are spared the second death and have a new lease on life, a new lease on eternal life. Final verse. And if anyone was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So the book of life is our seal. Without, if our name's not written in there, we have nothing. We have no recourse or chance of not being thrown into the lake of fire. If we don't make it, we're going to be taken into the lake, and rightly so. And the existence of hell causes some people to dispute the notion of a loving Elohim, but the fact is that he doesn't send anyone there. We send ourselves there. We have the formulas and the ingredients and the resources to know what we need to do in order to avoid that lot in death, which will be, because this life is not all we have. So we have the resources and equipment, and I hope that's the reason you're here. That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Bye-bye.